Hello, my name is Peter Atkinson and I want to tell you about the life and work of Antoni Gaudi, one of the world's most famous architects. The presentation has been prepared as if it were to be given live at one of the monthly meetings of the Javier U3A. Sadly, as long as the present coronavirus situation persists, such meetings are on hold. Instead, a fantasy. I shall imagine that the time is about 11:15 on Wednesday the 30th of September 2020 and that I am in the Parador standing in front of a full house of quiet, attentive faces. Who knows, maybe some of you are viewing this at that precise moment. So here goes. In the field of architecture, Gaudi was the leading exponent of the late 19th century, early 20th century movement known as Art Nouveau, Modernisme in Catalonia. He was an unusual man in terms of his lifestyle and personality, and in terms of the brilliance and innovativeness of his work, nearly all of which is in or around Barcelona. These are perhaps his four most well-known works, a church and three residential projects, all in Barcelona. We should look in some detail at these and at a number of others. Gaudi was an extremely pious man, attending Mass every morning and going to confession every evening. He led an austere lifestyle which included a very frugal and strict vegetarian diet. Latterly, he took little interest in his appearance. This newspaper cartoon shows him in a frayed suit and shoes that are falling apart. On Monday the 7th of June 1926, as always after a day's work, he walked the 3 kilometres to the church where he made his confession, and he was hit by a tram. Though his name was known to everyone, he went unrecognised, just another drunken tramp. He died on the Thursday and was buried in the crypt of the Sagrada Familia on the Saturday. His funeral was attended by everyone of importance in Catalonia, and hundreds of thousands of citizens turned out. How did we get to the eccentric, tramp-like figure aged 73 from the 26-year-old on the left? The young man was a well-tailored habitué of the most fashionable cafes in Barcelona, and a regular attendee at first nights at the Liceu Opera House. He was a difficult man to understand. He wrote few articles for architectural journals, was not a great letter writer, and didn't give interviews to the media. And most of the paperwork that he did leave behind was destroyed in the Civil War. He was born in Reus, a small town in the province of Tarragona, about 100 kilometres from Barcelona. It was a prosperous town, dependent on the processing of agricultural products. His family were coppersmiths, making stills for the production of alcohol. Antoni was the youngest of 5 children, the only one to live beyond the age of 35. As a child, he suffered frequent bouts of rheumatoid arthritis, and he spent much of his time on his own, observing the natural world. Following a number of preparatory courses, he began his architectural studies in 1874 at the Barcelona School of Architecture, today part of the Polytechnic University of Catalonia. He was enthusiastic and hard-working, but difficult. He wasn't keen on drafting detailed plans. He preferred to build 3-dimensional models and to improvise on site. He didn't think in terms of flat planes. He thought in terms of curves, bulges and undulations, the result of watching his father work with copper. He graduated in 1878, aged 26, after he learnt that success required doing things his teacher's way. Members of the faculty were not unanimous in deciding that he should be allowed to qualify, and the school's director wondered whether, quote, "we have graduated a genius or a madman." As a student, a feature that troubled Gaudi on the major Gothic buildings was the use of flying buttresses, arms of stone attached to the sides to prevent them from falling down. He said they were crutches and looked for an alternative solution. For the most part, load-bearing arches were of 3 kinds: the Romanesque semicircle, the fuller circle of the Moorish arch, and the intersecting arcs of the Gothic arch. Instead, Gaudi asks us to consider a chain held at each end and allowed to hang. Flip it over and you have a parabola. He thought this shape to be the best because nature uses it. He believed that God can always be relied upon to produce the ideal, both aesthetically and structurally. And nature does indeed use this parabolic arch, as here in Dorset and in southeastern France. He used it first in 1878, the year he graduated, in designing this bleaching shed for a textile factory in Mataró, a few kilometres from Barcelona. The thrust of the weight of the roof is directed down the legs of the arch, enabling the arch itself to be light and require no buttressing. Gaudi fell in love with a schoolteacher in Mataró, but it turned out that she was already engaged. Elsewhere, there are references to his interest in an American woman, with whom he lost touch when she returned to the US. These are the only hints of any romance in Gaudi's life, and he probably died a virgin. The late 19th century was a good time to be an architect in Barcelona. By mid-century, with the Industrial Revolution at its height, the old city was ready to burst, and for squalor and deprivation it was one of the worst in Europe. The Madrid government put forward a plan devised by Ildefons Cerdà for the Eixample, or extension, a huge development outside the old walled city, a grid of broad avenues. The plan would make it easy to suppress the locals. The broad straight avenues would be difficult to barricade and would facilitate cavalry charges and long-range cannon fire. Most of the plan was executed, the area contained by the Blue Line, and although the idea was short-lived, the original intention was that population densities would be kept low, each block retaining green space on two sides. In view of the technology of the day, Cerdà assumed that there would be a public transport system using steam-driven vehicles, which would need a wide turning circle. Hence the beveled corners on each block, which today provide 4 small parking lots at each intersection. I shall look at his work under 3 headings. First, some of his residential buildings, then the work he did for one particular client, Eusebio Güell, and finally, we'll look at the Sagrada Familia. Gaudi's first residence was for a tile and brickmaker, Manuel Vicens. Commissioned in 1878, the year Gaudi graduated, it took more than 10 years to complete, the main reason being Gaudi's tendency to change the design as he went along. It is evocative of Moorish architecture, as this comparison with the Royal Palace in Seville demonstrates. Gaudi was not a great traveller, but he was familiar with all architectural styles from close study of the School of Architecture's library of photographs. And there's Gothic influence as well. Compare these windows with the arches in the cloister of Tortosa Cathedral, not far from where Gaudi was brought up. Much of the tile work depicts the African marigolds that grew on the site before building commenced. The many delays nearly bankrupted Vicens. However, as a tile maker, he benefited in the end. Soon everybody wanted to have a house covered in ceramics. There's a lot of wrought iron and animal and plant motifs, very characteristic of Gaudi, and more generally, very characteristic of Art Nouveau. In the second half of the 19th century, there was no shortage of wealthy textile manufacturers in Barcelona, like Eduard Calvet, who commissioned Gaudi to build this apartment building in 1898. It was the most conventional building to be designed by Gaudi, and perhaps because it wasn't very radical, it won the award from the city for having the most artistic merit among buildings completed in the year 1900. It's the only official recognition Gaudi ever received. Gaudi's original plans were rejected by the city for breaching height limits. He threatened simply to truncate the building at the regulation height, and the city backed off. This was one of many run-ins that Gaudi had with the city's planners and architects. A feature of the building is the pair of large door knockers. Symbolising good smiting evil, the part you lift bears a cross and the plate underneath is a beetle. Or as Gaudi said, it represents Catalonia smiting the evil Castile. Anti-Madrid feeling was strong in Barcelona at the time. Catalan industry had been given a severe blow in 1898 by the short one-sided war with the United States, where Spain lost its last colonies, Cuba, Puerto Rico and the Philippines. These had been important to Catalan business, and their loss was put down to incompetence by Madrid. There were many modernist architects in Barcelona as well as Gaudi, these being the most important. Domènech was almost an exact contemporary, while Puig was somewhat younger. The three of them appear together in the same block in the Eixample, a short distance north of the Plaça de Catalunya. Gaudi's Casa Batlló is on the right, Puig is next door, and Domènech is at the far end. Like Gaudi, Domènech is often referred to as a genius. He was a faculty member at the School of Architecture when Gaudi graduated, and some believe that his was a dissenting voice when the vote as to whether Gaudi should be allowed to graduate was taken. Next door to Gaudi's Casa Batlló is Puig's Casa Amatller, built for a chocolate manufacturer. It predated Gaudi's by a couple of years. Puig was a Catalan nationalist, and St. George, the patron saint of Catalunya, appears on the facade of Casa Amatller. For the 1907 national elections, Puig was deputed to persuade Gaudi to take advantage of his high profile and stand as a candidate for Solidaritat Catalana, a separatist party. He refused, saying he was too busy, though he was not a fan of the ballot box. He said, quote, "Democracy is the rule of ignorance and stupidity." Gaudi did sympathise with the Catalan nationalist cause. He stubbornly refused to address any of his workers in Castilian. Somebody else had to interpret. Casa Batlló has absolutely no earlier architectural styles as its antecedents. The client, Josep Batlló, commissioned Gaudi because he wanted to impress his friends. The main floor was a flat for Batlló and his family, and on each of the other floors Gaudi created 2 flats for rental. Here Gaudi did not start with a vacant plot. Instead, he did a complete remodelling of a conventional building dating from 1877. He submitted plans in 1904 simply to get authorization to commence. Then, as usual, he modified the plan as he went along, finishing in 1908. These windows led to it being called the House of Bones, and with hardly a straight line anywhere, Batlló is a superb example of modernisme. Gaudi did not like to be associated with that particular movement, seeing the Modernistas as liberal progressives against traditional Catholicism. Gaudi said the roof represents the scaly back of the dragon, the balconies are the skulls of the people the dragon has killed, and the tower is the lance with which St. George killed the dragon. Built between 1906 and 1910, Casa Mila, or La Pedrera, is probably Gaudi's best-known work after the Sagrada Familia. The client wanted a block of luxury flats and approached Gaudi because he'd been impressed by Casa Batlló. It's a large building with 6 floors, plus a basement and attic. Gaudi produced a single facade which flows round the corner. This was the first building in Barcelona with an underground garage. In addition to an elevator shaft, he put in a pedestrian ramp for domestic staff, enabling owners to come and go without rubbing shoulders with the help. The iron balustrades, looking like seaweed, are a feature of the building. Gaudi planned an irrigation system connecting the balustrades, which would be covered with foliage, giving the building a less forbidding look. But his relationship with Mila came to an abrupt end, and he didn't get round to it. The roof is a sculpture park, arising from the treatment that Gaudi gave to the chimneys and ventilation shafts. He often submitted plans in order to get started and then did something different, believing planning regulations did not apply to him. Even without the roof sculptures, the building was too tall, the overall volume was too great, and part of it intruded onto the sidewalk. A huge fine was threatened until an exception was fudged together on the grounds of artistic merit. The contractor taken on by Gaudi to build Casa Mila nearly went broke as a result of Gaudi's way of working. The blocks of stone on the facade vary slightly in colour. Before each one was finally left in place, Gaudi had to approve, and some were up and down several times before he was happy. He did obtain extra cash from Mila to cover the additional man-hours. Gaudi's plan for Casa Mila was that it be topped with a bronze statue of the Virgin, 5 meters tall, flanked by the archangels Gabriel and Michael. Mary and the undulating walls of the building would represent the calming of the storms of life at the feet of the Mother of God. Models were made, and Mila did not like them. He knew the city would again bring up the height objection, and this time he believed that the artistic merit argument wouldn't work. Gaudi withdrew from the project, the Milas withheld some fees, and the issue ended up in the courts. The building was more or less finished anyway. A number of people have spoken of Gaudi's confrontational manner. One of Eusebi Güell's grandsons said that Gaudi was very convinced of the value of his own work, and that contributed to his despotic character. He was very sure of himself and became very annoyed when people opposed him. Nothing pleased him, and he liked no one. A priest friend said, "With Gaudi, you've either got to kill him or give in and tell him that he's right." So Gaudi was not an easy man to work with. He was arrogant and argumentative and had no regard for the client's budget or timing expectations. He only had one client who came back for a second project, Eusebi Güell, whom we shall meet in a moment. All Gaudi's clients became owners of a beautiful, prestigious building that was perfectly fit for purpose. But by the time the work was done, I think they usually wanted to lie down in a darkened room and whimper for 6 months. Even small projects could be problematic. This lighting was designed by a very young Antoni Gaudi in 1879. It is in the Plaza Real in Barcelona, and because of a row over his bill, it is the only project he ever did for the city. Now we'll turn to the most important projects that he worked on for Eusebi Güell, a successful second-generation industrialist involved principally in cotton textile manufacture. After also marrying well to the daughter of the Marquis of Comillas, he was said to be the wealthiest man in Spain. Unlike most factory owners and mill owners, he is described as an urbane, enlightened individual with a social conscience. He was widely travelled, a patron and student of the arts and sciences, a politician and a Catalan nationalist. With his bottomless pockets and infinite patience, he was the only kind of man who could be a long-term client of Gaudi. Between 1886 and 1900, Gaudi built a house for Güell right downtown on a narrow street just off the Ramblas, Palau Güell, next door to what was Barcelona's most notorious brothel. The entrance comprises 2 parabolic arches separated by the crest of Catalonia. A ramp led down to underground parking for horses and carriages. Gaudi was given a completely free hand and no preset budget. He used the most expensive materials and hired the best artists and artisans. Güell's private secretary did a lot of hand-wringing and complained to Güell about Gaudi's bills. Güell said, "Is that all he's spending? Tell him he's not spending enough." This remarkable hall extends to more or less the full height of the building and ends in a parabolic dome. It was used for meetings, concerts and parties. Visitors included the American President Grover Cleveland and Spanish royalty. The roof is similar to Casa Mila in terms of the treatment that Gaudi gave to the chimneys and ventilation shafts. The conical tower is a continuation of the dome of the main hall, letting in natural light. A 20-kilometre suburban train ride to the west of downtown Barcelona brings us to Colonia Güell, a workers' village that Güell built alongside a textile factory. He'd seen the same paternalistic concept in England, Lever's Port Sunlight in Cheshire and Cadbury's Bourneville near Birmingham. Concerned about their welfare and/or their productivity, he wanted to take control of his workers' lives by removing them from the city with its 3 A's: alcohol, atheism and anarchism. From 1890, Güell's associates built housing, a school, a community centre, a library and a theatre. An existing building served as a church, but as the community grew, larger premises were needed. In 1898, Gaudi began work on a new church. 10 years later, the first stone was laid. The plot wasn't flat, so Gaudi had in mind a crypt with a portico, above which, reached by a stairway, was to be the main body of the church. He devised an ingenious planning process, which he also adopted for the Sagrada Familia. He screwed a large board to a workshop ceiling, and he then suspended cords from the board representing the arches and vaults that he had in mind. Little bags of lead shot were attached to the strings, their weight proportional to the weight that the arches and vaults would have to support. Finally, he took photographs of the 4.5 metre high structure and flipped them over. He could now see the many parabolic arches that would be required and the angles at which each should be built in order to carry the load without buttressing. Gaudi fine-tuned his model for 10 years before building began in 1908. It came to an abrupt end in 1918 on Güell's death, with only the crypt and a small bell tower completed. Güell's children weren't prepared to indulge Gaudi any further. What was built is quite spectacular and extremely unusual. In the portico of the crypt, the many parabolic arches and their angled pillars are an impressive sight. Inside the crypt, the main supports are 4 angled basalt pillars. And the coloured glass windows are pleasing both from outside the crypt and inside. Park Güell was begun in 1900. It is a corruption of the English Garden City concept developed by the Quakers and left-wing thinkers like the Fabian Society and William Morris, and which included what we would call today affordable housing. However, Güell wanted a gated community exclusively for the wealthy. It was a failure. There were to be 60 plots, each of between 1,000 and 2,000 square metres, and a population of 300. Only 3 were sold. The Güell family moved into one in 1906, and Gaudi did so soon afterwards with his father and ailing niece. The park covers a hillside. There are 2 buildings by the gate, and from there a staircase rises to what was to be a covered market with classical columns, on top of which is a large plaza. Beyond is what was intended to be the residential land. By the gate, the building on the left was to be the porter's lodge, and the other the reception office. It's likely that these gingerbread houses, built in 1901-1902, were inspired by Hansel and Gretel. The Humperdinck opera had been a great hit at the Lyceum in 1900. Going up the staircase from here, one passes this lizard. There are 86 columns here, and the space was intended to be a market. Gaudi planned the park's water supply, making use of the columns. Rainwater on the plaza above seeps through the gravel and down through pipes inside the columns into an underground system. I found the graphics on the ceiling on the right of this slide very interesting. In the centre is Snoopy from the Peanuts comic strip, not created until several decades later. The plaza above the market is surrounded by a continuous bench, one of Gaudi's masterpieces. If you want to get an uncluttered photograph of a longish stretch of the bench, you can buy a picture postcard or go early on a very cold morning like this one. The bits of ceramic were obtained partly by scavenging. In addition to the amusement or bemusement of passers-by, cases of new tiles, shipped in from Valencia, were opened and the contents were immediately smashed. There are 3 kilometres of roadway in the park to serve the housing plots. Gaudi did not want to spoil the hillside using earth-moving equipment, so he built stone-faced viaducts blending with the trees. Why did the park fail? Well, here's the view from the park today. It's likely that the location was a problem. Too far away from the city for those who wanted to be part of it, and too close for those who didn't. Perhaps the restrictions on what people could do with their plot were an issue, and maybe some didn't want to be too close to Gaudi's eccentric output. Or maybe pricing was the problem in a then fragile economy. Gaudi was responsible for only 3 buildings outside the Barcelona area, all in northern Spain. On the left, El Capricho is in Comillas near Santander, built for a man who returned home after making a fortune in South America. He was introduced to Gaudi through Güell's in-laws. Casa Botines is in Leon and was built for 2 Catalan textile merchants of Gaudi's acquaintance. The Bishop's Palace in Astorga, west of Leon, was commissioned by Bishop Juan Grau, a man Gaudi knew from Tarragona. El Capricho and Casa Botines were built quickly because Gaudi didn't modify the design during construction. That's because he never visited El Capricho and his visits to Casa Botines were few and brief. In Astorga, Bishop Grau died while the palace was being built. Gaudi then had a row with the diocesan authorities over the building's complexity and price. In the end, the project was completed by another team in Gaudi's absence. Finally, the Sagrada Familia, as emblematic of Barcelona as the Eiffel Tower is of Paris. It's not a cathedral. The city has one in the old quarter dating back to the 13th century. And it's not owned by the church. It's owned by a private foundation. The Spiritual Association of Devotees of St. Joseph was set up by a bookseller, Jose Maria Boccabella, in 1866. Its objective, through the intercession of St. Joseph, was the re-establishment of traditional family values, which had been eroded with the urbanization that accompanied the Industrial Revolution. They soon decided that they needed a church for the expiation of sin. Following some years of fundraising and the acquisition of a plot, the first stone of the expiatory temple of the Holy Family was laid in 1882. The plans, a conventional neo-Gothic design, had been drawn up for free by the architect Francisco de Paula del Villar, who resigned following an argument over building materials. Boccabella saw in a dream the architect who would take over. A few days later he met Gaudi and recognized him as the man in the dream. A more mundane explanation is this. The project was a routine one that would last only a couple of years, and plans already existed. Gaudi was only 31 years old and inexperienced, but he was eager, and above all he was cheap, important for an organisation that depended on voluntary donations. Gaudi took over in March 1883, and he followed Del Villar's plan until the crypt had been completed, but with the support of other leading architects whose opinions the association sought, he soon obtained a free hand. As with a lot of other work that Gaudi did, much of it does not evoke any existing architectural tradition. These towers leap to mind when we conjure up a mental image of the Sagrada Familia, each with a parabolic profile that Gaudi developed. Gaudi's concept involved many more towers than the 8 that are complete today. He had in mind 18, as shown in this 1906 drawing. They can be seen more clearly in this model, the brown areas being progress that has been made to date. We have the 4 finished towers over the Nativity facade, with 4 matching towers on the far side over the Passion facade. These represent the Apostles, and bringing the total to 12, there will be 4 more on the left, surmounting the main facade, the Glory facade. 4 taller towers are dedicated to the Evangelists, and to the right of these there's a bulky tower dedicated to the Virgin. Finally, the huge central tower with the cross will represent Christ, 170 metres or 560 feet tall. Gaudi liked what the builders of Seville Cathedral had said when they began. We want to build something so massive that future generations will think we were mad. The 6 central towers, Christ, the Virgin and the 4 Evangelists, are growing simultaneously. This is the current situation viewed from the west, with the Passion facade at the front. And this is the view from the north, with the tower dedicated to the Virgin front and centre. The 6 towers are made up of precision-carved stone panels measuring 5 metres by 4 metres, fabricated off-site. The panels are slotted into a steel framework with M's and W's in alternating layers, and they're held together by horizontal and vertical steel rods. In front of the Glory facade on the south side, the red box is land that will be cleared to accommodate the main approach to the building. Here is the Glory facade. If the coronavirus doesn't ruin things, the target date for completion of the structural work is 2026, the centenary of Gaudi's death. Funding is strong, with in normal times over 3 million visitors per annum paying €25. A great deal of decorative work will remain to be done later, and the clearance of the area in front of the building will probably be bogged down in the court sweep for many years. On the end of the east transept, facing the rising sun, Gaudi created the Nativity facade, an extraordinarily detailed and enormous piece of storytelling. We have Mary and Joseph with the infant in the stable, with a cow and a horse looking on. Here's the flight into Egypt on the left to avoid the slaughter of the innocents ordered by Herod. Here's the young Jesus with St. Joseph, and below them a range of carpentry tools. And of course no nativity facade would be complete without the shepherds and the three magi. Little was done during the last 10 to 15 years or so of Gaudi's life. The flow of donations was too weak. To drum up interest in the project, he was always keen to show it to important visitors, like this papal nuncio. And architectural fashions were changing. The heyday of Art Nouveau and Modernisme was short, the 20-year period 1890 to 1910. This is the building in Barcelona that best illustrates the change that took place in architectural tastes. By Mies van der Rohe, it is the German pavilion for the 1929 Great Exhibition. It comprises sheets of marble, plate glass, concrete, steel, and straight lines and right angles, and an absence of decoration and clutter. That is, it's the exact opposite of Gaudi. This is what the Sagrada Familia was like around the time that Gaudi died. We are looking at it from the west, so the Nativity facade that we've just been examining is on the far side, and the four towers above it were more or less complete. After his death, progress continued to be slow, but in the 1960s the Surrealists, particularly Salvador Dalí, took up Gaudi, which led the young to do so as well. The young, many of whom would congregate here, liked Gaudi because they assumed from his work that he was a cultural subversive, when in fact he was of course the complete opposite. And soon the revival fed through to a wider population. On this side, the west side, Gaudi planned to include the Passion facade, which would portray Christ's suffering. Sadly, he didn't get around to it, but in this 1911 sketch shows what he had in mind. This is how it turned out. The overall structure of Gaudi's approach has been respected, but the statues, for which no clear guidance existed, have nothing to do with Gaudi. The art critic Robert Hughes described this facade as the most blatant mass of half-digested clichés to be plunked on a notable building in living memory. It incorporates a statue of Gaudi alongside figures that are a cross between some of the sculptures on the roof of Casa Mila and Darth Vader. Gaudi was also innovative inside. In a large Gothic church, the pillars rise vertically for most of the building's height before the inward curvature begins to create the vaulting. Even with pillars as thick as these, outside buttressing is needed to prevent collapse. Gaudi's pillars are astonishingly slender, and with nature as the model, in this case a tree, they divide in three places at the red arrows. You can see how he's created his parabolas, removing the need for buttressing. The church was covered and the organ installed in 2010. It was consecrated by Pope Benedict in November 2010, and the interior decoration is now virtually complete. there's a great deal of glass in non-traditional colours. So, except for some decorative work on the exterior, the building will be finished soon, close to 150 years after the first stone was laid and a century after Gaudi's death, the work of generations of architects, artists and artisans. It was begun at a time when construction still involved cementing fairly small pieces of brick or stone on top of each other, and it is being completed by assembling large computer-carved slabs of stone. Being the innovator that he was, I think Gaudi would have approved. I also believe that it will reflect the vision that Gaudi had at the time of his death. However, we know that he tended to make it up as he went along. If he had lived to complete it, we don't know in what directions he would have moved, even without new materials and technologies to stimulate his creativity. So that's the story of Antoni Gaudi. But finally, let me quote again the director of the Barcelona School of Architecture. On the day in 1878 on which Gaudi qualified, he asked, "Have we graduated a genius or a madman?" Well, he certainly was a man of extremes, a very pious Catholic and a committed Catalan nationalist, with an austere lifestyle and aggressive manner. He was brilliant artistically and technically and very innovative. He had a hands-on management style, and time and budgetary constraints and the regulatory framework were for other people. They didn't apply to him. He definitely wasn't mainstream. Taken together, it seems to me that these aspects of Gaudi's personality take us a considerable way beyond mere eccentricity. He was a genius and a madman. Thank you very much indeed for listening.